says we're on. So Sam is our equivalent of the great and powerful Oz, and you do not want to ignore the man behind the curtain, because Sam, without Sam, we couldn't run this. Welcome to our September Live, brought to you by Titebond. Thanks very much to Titebond for sponsoring this and keeping it free for all of you folks at home or in your shop or wherever you are. We have Tyler on the camera. Ginny is ready to get props as needed. All right? Could you do me a favor and just go maybe turn off the volume on my computer in there, because it's obviously on. We've got questions queued up already, so we're going to jump right in here. I'm going to say something before I jump into questions, and I did post this earlier on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, I don't monitor the questions on YouTube because it's just too much to go forth and back and forth. So if you've got a question, go to WWGOA.com, upper left hand corner it says videos, click on that, menu appears, WWGOA Live, click on that, September, that's where you want to post your questions. So if you're asking them on YouTube, I will never, ever, ever, ever see them. Here we go. Michael says, hey George. Hey. Watching tonight from the Florida Panhandle. Did the hurricane affect you, Michael? Did it go that far south? I don't know. New to woodworking and find that choices locally are limited to whatever the big box stores carry, and that's true across the country. I have access to some locally sourced pecan and hickory and want to know any special consideration when using these, and are they a good choice? And then he says, roll tide. Is roll tide a hurricane reference? Like the tide is really coming in? Is that... I am the least sports-oriented person in the world, the least sports-oriented male in this country. But I do know what roll tide means. Pecan and hickory are both great. If you were watching my Instagram stuff maybe a month and a half or 2 months ago, I did a kitchen table in hickory. It was beautiful. And honestly, I was so surprised, I was disappointed that I haven't tried it before this in my woodworking life. Working with both of those, they can be a little bit splintery, a little bit prone to chipping and tearing when you're jointing or planing. So good sharp knives in a planer and joiner, or make sure your hand plane is sharp if that's your approach. But they're both beautiful woods. They're really nice and great hardwoods to work with. Steve says hello from Port Angeles, Washington. Stephen asks, I know you use aqua coat lacquer. Do you use aqua coat filler on open grain woods like oak and walnut? If you do you coat with the filler before or after the shellac? So if you've not seen my finishing recipe, here's what I normally do. A base coat of de-waxed shellac, which if you're looking for the particular product, it's called Zinsser Seal Coat. And seal coat is simply de-waxed shellac. I put that on first, let that flash, let it dry, and then I do water-based lacquer over the top of that. So the other thing you can do, and I did it on the hickory table, aqua coat makes grain filler. And what's the deal with grain filler? Oddly enough, it fills the grain. When you're working with porous woods, red oak is such a great example. There are all of those pores in wood. If you've finished something in oak and you meticulously sanded it and you got finish on there, and then afterward you were disappointed because you run your fingernails across there and they're like, and you feel like, man, I did a lousy job finishing, or the finish never leveled or something like that. It's not you, nor is it the finish. It's the open grain nature of oak. So with a grain filler, it invisibly gets in there and it fills those pores. So when your top coat goes over the top, you have a much more level surface on that hickory table. I couldn't believe the dramatic difference it made. So, a couple questions here. One, Stephen, yes, I do use the aqua coat grain filler. Two, if you are only doing raw wood, shellac, aqua coat, top coat, then the grain filler goes on the raw wood. If you're doing stain, then what you want to do is stain, shellac, grain filler, top coat. And the reason for that, the aqua coat folks told me this, It sometimes happens, I guess not all the time. I haven't experimented with it because they told me not to do it. If you do the stain and then you do the grain filler over the stain, sometimes the grain filler pulls the stain and kind of muddies your color. So if you're staining, the recipe is stain, de-wax shellac, grain filler, top coat. Shane says, making a few cutting boards for Christmas presents, always a big hit. Few questions. Does oil soak in better on rougher sanded boards? Dos, what final grip do you recommend? Tres, should final sanding be done before or after the oiling process? So going to question number one, does oil soak in better? Maybe, but you don't want rough boards. If you're making a cutting board, let's jump to question number two, what final grit? I would sand a hardwood cutting board to 180 for sure, probably 220, and then apply the oil to that sanded surface. Then your last question, final sanding be done before or after the oiling process? You know, I have wet sanded hardwoods with a little bit of oil on them, and then like wet sanding a finish on a car, wet sanded it at that point. In all honesty, if you've already sanded it to 220 and then you oil it, I don't think it's going to need any sanding on top of that. So you could be done once the oil is on. Robert says, how to cut finger joints on 24-inch wide boards with a radial arm saw fitted with a dado. Well, Robert, you might be the only person left in America with a radial arm saw. I had one when I opened my old shop. I had one, a very useful tool. My insurance company would let me use it. They wouldn't let my students in class use it. So a 24-inch wide board, and of course a radial arm saw, I'm pointing to my sliding miter saw. Like a sliding miter saw is going to pull across our work. We put a dado head in there. I would say, I can't envision a way that if what you're planning on doing, let me grab a board. If this is your 24-inch wide board, and what you want to do is finger joint the ends like this, so this board can join another one, I can't envision a means by which you can stand this on end and cut those fingers in here. Because you've got to get the dado head pulled through this way. For instance, if I were doing this on a table saw, dado head coming out of the table saw, I'd be feeding across the top of it like this. That you need to emulate that on your radial arm saw. I can't picture a way to pull that off. So I could be very wrong, but I'm thinking that a radial arm saw just isn't going to do the joinery that you want to do on that particular project. Steven says, do you cut thin resaw next to the fence or away from the blade? I assume you're talking about the bandsaw. Let's head for the bandsaw, Tyler. And I can't, I won't be able to resaw because I've got a really small blade in there right now. But we can talk through it. So, Steven's question is, we're setting up to resaw, and you want to cut real thin stock. So am I going to do this? Veneer, you're usually shooting for about 3/32 of an inch. Am I going to do this, peel it off the inboard side, or this, peel it off the outboard side? I always take it off the outboard side. Now, here's the sequence of events. I clean up this face, probably face jointed on my joiner. I clean up that face, I position the fence, I cut my veneer from the outboard face, I clean up the saw marks that just appeared on this board, I move my fence, I cut, make another cut. I clean up the saw marks, move my fence, make another cut. So the downside of this is that every time we're cutting a new piece, we're moving the fence to peel it off the outboard side. The benefit, what I find, is that when I resaw veneer, if I try to do it with the thin piece in between the blade and the fence, the board has a tendency to collapse into the cut. And for me, it's pretty much impossible to get a good straight cut. Where, if I'm peeling it off the outboard side, then of course that thin piece is just peeling away, so we don't have that issue. So that has a lot more appeal to me. Oh, they're not even listening. So that's all right, I laugh at my own jokes. Nobody needs to laugh at it. So the answer to your question, Stephen, is set it up. I always set it up so I'm taking them off the outboard side, and a little more work because you're moving the fence each time, but I think a better result. Maybe Jenny, just grab my laptop and hand it to me just in case. I'll watch this so you don't bonk me. But thank you for thinking of my head. Thank you, dear. All right. Tim McFarland says, hi George, I have a 12 by 20 Dutch barn I use as a wood shop. I struggle with dust collection in the small space. 12 by 20, that's a nice space. I've considered a shop vac with tornado filter option. We'll come back to that. Would you find that as sufficient or opt for a dedicated dust collection system? Perhaps you have one you recommend. So let's talk shop vacuums versus dust collectors for a second. So in broad strokes, what we can say is a shop vac is a high suction, low CFM device, CFM, cubic feet per minute. A dust collector is a high CFM, cubic feet per minute, low suction. So suction is often measured, easy to say, in inches of water. And literally what that means is if I hook a hose up to a pipe, how many inches up the pipe, and the end of the pipe is in a bucket of water, how many inches will it pull water up the pipe? With a shop vac, you'll get it a long way up because it's got a lot of suction, it's got a lot of vacuum. With a dust collector, you'll barely get water to come up the pipe. So the problem with what you're describing, Tim, is that, for instance, on a table saw, the recommended CFM for adequate dust collection on most table saws is around 400 CFM. Most shop vacuums operate at about 90 CFM, maybe 100. So they got a lot of vacuum, they don't move a lot of air. Now, a couple, not really exceptions to the rule, but a couple qualifiers. If all you've got for dust collection is a shop vacuum, it is way more better than nothing. But especially when you get to something like a jointer or a planer, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for a shop vacuum to keep up with the volume of stuff, the volume of shavings coming off of those tools. I do find a shop vacuum works pretty well on a router table. It works okay on like a benchtop table saw maybe, where all you're doing is cutting. When you get to stuff like dado cuts on a full-size table saw, I think a shop vacuum would have a really hard time keeping up with the dust that you're creating. So, like I said, it's certainly better than nothing, but a shop vacuum is not a great choice for general dust collection in your shop. Gary says, with Titebond glue polyurethane and Titebond 3, are they both food safe? Titebond 3 is, hey Jenny, could you grab the, let me look in that, oh I think you're going to have to go this way. Grab a bottle of Titebond 3, if there is one, and a bottle of the polyurethane glue, because I actually can't remember if it's labeled, that's not it. You could look, if you go in that storeroom right there, there's all the extra glue bottles are on the shelf kind of above your head. So Ginny will retrieve that and we'll see. Like I said, Titebond 3 is, and Titebond 2 is, I'm not sure if polyurethane. Nothing? Let me walk this way and I'll see if I got one. I've got a 3. Oh, I've got them both. We kind of got stuck on that glue question. Yeah, thank you. All right, so right here on the 3, it flat out says FDA approved for indirect food contact. Polyurethane, I'm reading very fast. It does not say that this is food safe. If you want to double check that, Titebond of course would know. but just from reading the labels, it clearly says it on one, not the other. I live in the Philippines, Gary goes on, where it is always wet and humid, was wondering on the difference. I'm guessing Titebond 2 is good for indoor items and seems to be food safe, but not as much as 3. So the difference between 2 and 3, water resistant, waterproof. Titebond 2, if you're putting together an Adirondack chair, where yes, it's going to get rained on every once in a while, Titebond 2 is fine. Titebond 3, if you're building a planter, where you're going to fill it with soil and it's under constant exposure to moisture, 3 is going to be a better choice for you. All right, and then Gary says, can you go into details about what to look for in Japanese double-sided saws? One is for ripping and one is for cross-cutting. I'd like more information about other options of what to look for when buying one. So Ginny, if you could grab, see the, it's a bamboo handled saw on the pegboard, just to the left of the spoke, or, yep, cabinet scraper, yep. So here's what Gary's talking about, and unfortunately, Gary, I'm going to grossly disappoint you. I own a couple of these, so here's what we're talking about. Japanese double-sided saw. Fine teeth on this side, coarse teeth on this side, cross-cutting versus ripping. If you're not already aware of it, with Japanese saws, they cut on the pull stroke instead of the push stroke. One of the things that allows is a really thin blade. What's the benefit to that? Thin kerf, so we're fighting the saw less as we cut because we've got a thinner kerf saw. The other thing that I really like about it is that as you cut, because you cut on the pull stroke, you're tensioning the blade on the cuts. With Western style saws, you're cutting on the push stroke, so you're putting resistance against it that way, and we've probably all experienced when a handsaw flexes like crazy. It's kind of a Three Stooges looking thing. And with a Japanese saw, they're not going to do that. So I learned to do hand tool work on Western saws, conventional dovetail saws, overseas in Africa. When I got back here, I switched to Japanese saws. That being said, I own a couple of these, Gary. In all honesty, I think I bought this at a woodcraft store at some point. I don't know what I was shopping for, you know. If other people have information on these, put them in the comments. At the end of the day, I own a couple, but I don't have good buying advice as far as characteristics to look for. I love the saw. I'm glad I have it, but I can't give you much help there. Sorry. Is the bandsaw the best way to cut a 4-inch square glue up of coasters? I was using a miter gauge to hold the board straight and was getting some drift on my saw table. Is the issue likely with my bandsaw or my technique? Well, it's such a small piece. I would be inclined, I like the idea of doing it on the bandsaw because that's a nice safe way to handle small parts. Jenny, I'm going to send you in that direction. Good thing we stayed here. So see the jig, see the saw stop break on the pegboard that's blown, the blown break? No, right above where you are. That jig is the one we want. Yep, that jig is up. Lost my train of thought. So I like the idea of cutting that on the bandsaw because it's little. Let me trade you for glue. Heads up. Heads up. It's like living in the, like working in the circus. So Tyler, I'm going to make you work a second. This is my bandsaw small parts jig. So the way this works, and this is included, we've got a jigs and fixtures class online, GOA does, and this jig is included in that class. So miter gauge slot, miter gauge track goes in the miter slot, like that, and then shloop, 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 shloop. In fact, I'll cut this piece of maple wood just to show you, because it's cool. Thank you, Jenny. Jenny brought a stool over for my laptop because she recognizes that's an accident waiting to happen. I use this all the time. Don't ask me why I only put one earpiece in, that was stupid. I use this all the time for cutting small parts. So, for you, Gary, small 4-inch coasters, 4x4 coasters, you could use a sled like this on your bandsaw, which would probably give you better results than a miter gauge. The other way to do it, I would probably be inclined to make a sled for my table saw that includes a toggle clamp. So now, Ginny, if you could bring, actually, let me think a second. If you go into that Axiom CNC, like 3 drawers down, there are a bunch of red handled clamps. I would probably make a jig for my table saw that's got a toggle clamp on it, which Ginny's about to bring us, I think. Like that, but different. There's another style in there. Nope, it's just like what you had in your hand. Maybe check a different drawer. I know they're in there. Yes, ma'am, either one of those. And use the toggle clamp to secure the work so your pinkies don't have to get close to the blade. Toggle clamp, so this is going to get fastened to your jig. This is going to be out here. So when you throw the clamp, bloop, that's going to hold the coaster down, and then you can make your cut without having your fingers uber close to the blade. The reason I'm saying go to the table saw is you're going to get a better cut there than you do with the bandsaw, so you'll have less sanding to do. And Gary points out there are 2 different Garys asking questions. So it wasn't a Gary asking like 16 questions, it was a couple of Garys. Todd World says, good evening and hello from Houston, Texas. In some of the GOA classes showing cabinet builds, I noticed you don't use sleepers in the middle of your toe kick. Do you think they're really necessary? I guess not, because I don't know what sleepers are and I don't use them. I think in the classes, most of the cabinets I've done have been relatively narrow. If a cabinet has, so if a sleeper is a thing to like carry the toe, when I'm building a 40-inch long base cabinet, it's going to have a mid-wall, and that mid-wall is also going to carry the toe, so that's serving that purpose for me. So hopefully, Todd, that answers your question. So Chris says he's forcing his mother-in-law to watch with him. So Elizabeth, I hope you're staying awake, and Chris fed you plenty of caffeinated product, like coffee, before we started, because I am guessing if you're not a woodworker, this is as boring as the day is long. So hi Elizabeth, and thanks for watching. And Tim wants to know if Gary is the most common name in woodworking. It's the most common name in Indiana. Craig says, what is the best way to fill pine and not have issues staining it after? So you're pining over some staining issues. I'm on such a roll tonight, it's crazy.
Roll Tide.
Yeah, roll tide. So you can do a couple things, Craig. Here's the problem. There are woods that are inherently blotchy when you stain them. Pine is one, birch is one, maple is one. So products like a wood conditioner, you put that on before you stain, it soaks into the wood, and you'll be amazed at what a difference that makes. It really levels out the quality of your stain when you put the stain on. So wood conditioner is one choice. What I more commonly do, hey Ginny, could you grab a can of that Zinsser seal coat out of the finishing cabinet, because we keep talking about it. I more commonly spray a coat of Zinsser seal coat, and this is like, the first time I did this was so counterintuitive, because I'm like, well, you're sealing the whole thing with shellac, and then you're going to stain over that, but you've already sealed it. I think one shelf down from where you're looking, maybe. Oh, I see it right in front of your right elbow. So like 2 shelves down from where you are. One more shelf down, that brown can right there. I think that's a seal coat. So another option for you, Craig, is to seal everything with seal coat. So that the key to this is it's shellac, but it's de-waxed shellac. seal everything with this, lightly sand it, 220 grit, then stain over this, and it will still stain, and it'll level out that blotchiness issue. It works amazingly well. The other thing you may notice is even if you have woods that are not so blotchy, so maybe you're gonna stain cherry, although why you would, I don't know, but maybe you are. But I'm picking cherry because it's such a nice close grained wood. But end grain pretty much always stains darker than face grain. Same treatment. Give only the end grain a coat of de-wax shellac before you stain, and you'll have uniform stain color everywhere. Of course, as always with finishing, experiment with this stuff on scrap before you use it on a real project. But shellac is my go-to for that. Robert is saying 1 by 12 by 24 inch boards. So we're back to the radial arm saw, the finger joints on the radial arm saw question, and then goes on to say the arm swivels 360 degrees. Maybe there'd be a way to do this if you turn the cutter instead of this way. I'm trying to remember my radial arm. I think my radial arm also turned this way. So could the board stand up like this, and then you're pulling it through, cutting a finger, raising the dado head, pulling it through, cutting a finger. It'd be really hard to be accurate with that, but maybe that would work. I don't know. It sounds like possibly not the best tool for the job. James is asking, this is my first online event like this. Is there a video that goes with? Yeah, so James, look above where the questions are being typed. I'm going to go up there now just to make sure. But boy, I hope we're... And it says, so on my screen, I'll show you, it says, learn from the woodworking pros, which I guess they mean me. That seems weird. But then I think if I click this, it's going to be, yeah. An online event like this, is there a video that's us. Yeah, so James, look above. That's kind of weird. It's like the Twilight Zone thing. I'm going to go up there now just to make sure. Where's my pause? All right, yeah, so click that window up there and you'll get live action video. And then too, remember this stuff is always archived. So, oh, stop it. So if there's anything you want to go back and revisit, these are always free and they're archived forever. So a couple things, 725. One, thanks to Titebond, we're standing in a different part of the shop, so the banner's over there, but still, nah, you're okay. Thank you to Titebond. Two, I mentioned this at the top, if you're watching on YouTube and you're posting questions there, I'm not going to see them because we only monitor questions on WWGOA.com. So if you got a question you want me to put my peepers on, make sure you go to GOA.com, videos, WWGOA Live, September, and post your question. Sam answered the same question. All right, continuing. I scrolled down a little too far. Robert says, oh, my 16-gallon Craftsman shop vac keeps up with the 5/8 dado on my radial arm. That's good to know. So he is getting that, he's speaking to the airflow issue. So it is keeping up with the dust it's created, which is great. James says, I recently spoke with Titebond about this, so now we're back to the glue question, and they said both 2 and 3 are FDA approved. Yeah, that I knew. It's the polyurethane that I, as far as I can tell, is not necessarily, is not FDA, I don't think, but check with Titebond. What's the best finish sealer for a live edge slab? Well, there isn't really a best one, you know, finish is more about like what's the best finish sealer for you. So in my case, I have a facility in which I can spray, so I spray on my finish. That affects what finishes I choose to use. If you can't spray, that'll affect what finishes you choose to use. So it's not really about the fact that it's a live edge, it's what different finishes do. Oils that you can just wipe on with a rag are super easy to wipe on, wipe off the excess, and you're about done at that point. Polyurethanes offer a lot of protection, but they take a long time to dry. So if you're finishing in your shop and there's a little bit of dust mites falling out of the air still, there's a good chance they're going to get in your finish. Lacquer is a fairly protective finish, dries very fast. Solvent-based lacquers have a real strong smell that many people don't like. So if you're finishing in a basement, probably not a good choice. So we've got, for just general like information on finishing, we've got a finishing class, and it walks you through attributes of a bunch of different kinds of stains, a bunch of different kinds of top coats, and it's really provided to be a primer on just to help you choose, if I'm doing this, what's a good finish to pick for it, and if this is my only means of application, what's a good finish choice for me. Ross asks, do you use the Festool Domino? I do. I use it and I love it. It's a great tool. It is not inexpensive. And I always say Festool doesn't owe me anything and I don't owe them anything. That being said, owning a Festool Domino in my furniture work, I will probably never cut a traditional mortise and tenon again. The Domino is so fast and so easy and so strong. It's an amazing way to put stuff together. So yeah, I love it. I've actually got both of them. I've got the small one and the big one, and I use them all the time. I own a mortiser, so I can cut mortises pretty easy. But like I said, with the Domino here, every furniture project I've done recently, you know, typical rail to leg construction has been put together with Dominoes. What's the best way to cut a plastic lens for a fluorescent light fixture? Let's go, Tyler, toward the saw, table saw. And Jenny, if you could throw that, once we make a move, maybe I'll take that drinky drink because I'm running out of liquid. So I headed for the table saw because you should be able to cut fluorescent light lenses here at your table saw. And really, it's going to be all about blade selection. You want to have a, in fact, you can tell plastic is the last thing this was used on because that's plastic right there. You want to use a fine-tooth blade, and in the, I'll try to lock down, did you zoom? Fine-tooth blade, and the other thing to pay attention to is the hook or rake of the blade. So that is how much angle the teeth are at or aren't at. If the teeth are really leaning into the cut, when you read the blade, it'll say like, it might say 10-degree hook. And that means it's leaning forward into the cut 10 degrees. This one I think is, this one is a 10-degree. You can go 5-degree, you can also go negative hook. So you want to have 10 degrees or less really for cutting plastic. What that does is it makes it less aggressive. So you'll get a better result on your on that fluorescent lens. All right, that's helpful. Can Titebond products be thinned if they become too thick to pour? Boy, I think if it got too thick to pour, I would question the viability of the glue. I hate to answer this one because glue, of course, is a pretty important part of your project, and I don't want to lead you down a primrose path here. I would call Titebond and ask them, but I feel like if it sat so long that it thickened up, what does a bottle of glue cost? What did your project cost to make? Time and materials. Maybe just buy a new bottle of glue. I would be hesitant to thin it out because of just the chemistry of it. Guest 2117, I haven't seen that before, the guest thing, moniker, says good evening George, so good evening to you, ma'am or sir. Another guest, as a new woodworker, what power tools are a must for my shop? I have a 25 by 10 foot space and currently have a planer, jointer, table saw, chop saw, anything missing. I would get, the next tool would be a credit card with a really high limit, and then get whatever you want. Let's see, I don't know, planer, joiner, table saw, chop saw. So you're in great shape there in the world of portable power tools, a handheld router, a good sander, a random orbit sander. A router table, I think, is a wonderfully versatile piece of equipment. Small space, you could get that as either a bench top or a floor mount, depending on how your layout works for you. So you're doing, I think you're doing well on your round of tools you have there. Maybe tertiary down the list, maybe a drill press at some point. It's a boring tool, but they're handy to have. But if you can do a lot of work with a, Jimmy just got there.
Boring is another word for drilling.
And Tyler didn't get it until Ginny explained it. That's because Ginny did her work study here in the shop as a senior in high school, so she's got more ins in the woodworking world than Tyler does. Now I lost my train of thought. There's a lot of work that you can do with a drill press you can do with handheld drills. So depending on what you're doing, a drill press may or may not be too high on the list. James tells us, he's posted a link here for us where you can go to Titebond and see the FDA stuff on their products. John stained a jewelry box and decided after to add feet that attach to corners of the box. Is there a preferential clue to attach, clue, but I think you mean maybe glue, to attach unfinished feet to a stained box? Well, yeah, so as a rule, if the wood's already got finish on it, glue is going to have a hard time sticking. What I would lean toward doing is sanding only the area where the feet are going to go, and try to sand down to where, you know, it doesn't have to be completely raw wood, but get to where you're seeing some raw wood. And then once you've got that, you could go back to just yellow glue and use that to put the feet on. But I would start by removing some of the finish so that you've got a wood-to-wood bond that isn't interfered with by the finish. Alistair says, looking for easy ways to glue up tabletops. Let me think on that a second and see if I can grab some material. We'll head for the glue table and do a little walkthrough. We'll come back to that. Mark says, how does one get rid of a radial arm saw? Yeah, I mean, you could Craigslist it, because obviously people like, was it Roger? Or I'm forgetting names here. People are still using them, so you might be able to sell it. And you could poke around with that. There might be somebody out there who wants it. Since I retired, I gave all my tools to my sons, and we moved to a retirement community. I only have a small double-car garage, and the car and golf cart barely fit in. We got to have priorities, so you got the golf cart in there. I bought a Shopsmith to be able to have something because it doesn't take up much room. What do you think of the Shopsmith other than having to keep switching tools on it? I have a long history with Shopsmith. I worked for them starting in about 1986. And then overseas with Peace Corps, came back, worked for Shopsmith again. I always liked, especially for people with small space, the Shopsmith offered a lot of versatility. Just a really important aspect, so that if you're not familiar, what happens with the Shopsmith is it's a 5-in-1 tool: table saw, drill press, horizontal bore, disc sander, and wood lathe. And when you're doing each of those operations, you're going to change it from one to the other. Additionally, there are tools, joiner, bandsaw, planer, that can be connected to the power head so that you have more options. So every time you're going to do something, you're interchanging tools. You're not going to walk from the table saw to the drill press. You're going to, you're going to take this tool and change it from a table saw to a drill press. So it's really important that you plan your work and work your plan so that you're efficient about making those changes. So I haven't used a Shopsmith, Eddie, for a long time. But like I said, back in the day, I mean, I got to a point where I owned 2 or 3 of them because I liked the way they worked. So I appreciate their efficiency. In the discussion about shop vacs, Jim asks, do cyclones make a difference in your recommendation to not use them for planers and joiners? Well, I think if you're adding a cyclonic cylinder after the tool and before the shop vacuum, there might be a little bit of air loss there. I know a friend of mine, he's got one, I think he's got a Festool system, and he's got the Dust Deputy from Oneida, and he loves it. He uses it in line between the Festool and whatever tool he's using, and he loves that. Then he's just dumping a bucket of stuff. He's not constantly emptying bags out of the vacuum. So my guess is you've got a little air dynamic going on there, and you're gonna have some loss. But I think the gain of having this in-between chamber where you're dropping all that stuff out and you're not sending those chips to clog up the filter on your vacuum is gonna make it worth it. Chris asked, do you have a video of the bench you recently built and showed on Instagram? I don't. So here's what, let's go back to this thing, to the main bench. We'll circle around here, Tyler. And the question, or the project Chris is asking about is this workbench. And in retrospect, I should have had this in mind when I built it. In all honesty, what happened is I wanted a 4x8 bench in the worst way, and I started putting this thing together, and honestly, I planned in my head and I built as I went, and this is what I came up with. Since then, dozens of people have asked about it, like probably more than dozens of people. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to get a bunch of photos of it. I'm going to do some amount of SketchUp work, probably not super detailed, but enough to give you a general perspective on how the thing went together. And then I'll put that on the Von Driscoll Woodworks site, vondriscollwoodworks.com. There's a page on there that's got other downloads on it. And once that's available, you can email me if you want to get on an email list that'll let you know when it's available. And I'll just give that away, because it's not going to be, like I said, it's not going to be super detailed, but hopefully give you enough information to let you do it. And part of the reason I didn't do that from the get-go is that it's a 4x8 bench. And I know most woodworkers are in small spaces. I'm in 3,600 square feet. So I thought, well, I'm not going to bother documenting this because so few people can use a 4x8 bench. So, my fault. So, I inherited an older basic table saw from my late father-in-law. The fence is not the greatest. What recommendations do you have for replacement? Some companies like Biesmeyer, now I got to think a second, Delta owns Biesmeyer, and Delta had some issues about production. So I would Google to see if Biesmeyer fences are still in the marketplace. Biesmeyer. I've had table saws where I've added those as aftermarket fences to the table saw. It's an amazing fence. The other thing is just Google aftermarket table saw fence and see what you find. But that Biesmeyer has served me well as an add-on for a couple different saws. Hussein says, hey George, I hear you've been to the east. This is correct, I am a traveling man. Some of you will get that, some of you won't. Cliff says, George, could you suggest the best ways to ground the dust extraction system, please? He's watching from the bush in Canberra, Australia, so that's pretty cool. Here's the thing, Cliff. I'm going to be more comfortable if you get this information from Clearview or Oneida or somebody that really knows what they're talking about. Because I'd hate to be the guy you call in like a week and say, I blew up my shop because you didn't tell me how to ground it correctly. So do I have dust collectors? Yes, they're actually all on spiral pipe. So I didn't have to ground the system because they're on spiral pipe. So I don't want to lead you down a primrose path here. So I appreciate you asking. However, I'm going to ask that you get that information from someone who knows way more than I. Dave says, I agree with Robert. I love my radial arm saw. With the right accessories, it'll do everything. And I don't disagree, and I don't mean to put them down. They're amazing tools. And when you see these books from like the 50s and 60s about all the different stuff, especially with accessories, you can do on a radial arm. I used to use a Wagner safety planer when I taught for Shopsmith. And that was originally a radial arm saw accessory. And you would turn the head sideways, connect this safety planer to the spindle coming out of the motor, and it was a rotary, like a fly cutter. It was a fly cutter. So if you wanted to flatten a surface like you would with a planer, you could pull this back and forth across the surface. What an amazingly versatile tool. So radial arm saws have their place. Somebody asks, I want to retread my stairs with 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch red oak. Do I cut the current overhang off or use deeper treads to cover the current edge? I'm not sure. I can't visualize this, and it's kind of a home improvement question, maybe not a woodworking question. Let me read it again. Going to retread my stairs with oak. Do I cut the current overhang off or use deeper treads? Oh, you're talking about refacing the treads? I don't know, it would depend on the look. I don't think I can answer this question because there's a lot of variables here. I would mock it up. I would mock up the new tread in a way, I guess, where you're leaving, where you're creating a deeper tread to cover the edge, and see if you like how that looks. And if you do, keep going. And if you don't, go back to option 1. Jim asks, what cut list software do you use? I use Cut List Plus from Bridgewood Design. And what I'm starting to mess with, I've been using SketchUp for maybe 6 months or so. I'm just getting better at it. But anyway, there's a Cut List plugin for SketchUp, and I have it, I got it, but I haven't used it extensively yet. So that if you're, Jim, if you're a SketchUp guy, you might want to entertain trying that plugin. I do know people that have had success with it, so that would be another option. But to date, big cabinet projects, Cut List Plus from Bridgewood. Tim says, I'm jealous of your hoard of clamps. I'm doing a lot of cutting boards for family. Seems to be the Christmas trend this year. Finishing with walnut oil. I think it's just preference, but would you finish with anything after that, like a wax? I think with walnut oil, you're done. I think that can be your top coat on a cutting board. Robert is advising us on the thicken glue. He says, I'm a chemist. Thicken glue is half set. Bonding to your material has fewer molecules. So net, Robert is saying don't use the thick glue. If you want to double check, give Titebond a jingle, and they'll answer for you. Kevin, oil-based finishing products sometimes contain a warning label indicating that dust created by sanding between coats is subject to spontaneous combustion. Makes sense. Any suggestion for safely collecting the dust produced when sanding between coats? Well, what you need to not do is get it airborne. So don't blow it then with an air compressor. I guess I can see this, just like a flour mill explosion or a sawdust explosion. In this case, that dust, not only is it dust, which is prone to combusting, but it's also a very volatile product, it's finished. So I guess I would wipe it down with a rag. It'd probably be the safest way, then you're not getting it airborne. Casper asks, I need a 1x3 oak board that needs to be rounded on one end, semicircle. How would you perform this cut? Jigsaw, handheld jigsaw, or a bandsaw? Steve asks, I find that as I use my router table, the insert seems to move up and down, and I need to re-level it. Is there a way to keep the insert steady level? I thought of using Loctite, but mine was way too old to try. Oh, yeah, I would use Loctite. So are you saying, if what you're saying, Steve, oh, then he goes on, the router insert seems to move over time while using the table, if that makes sense. So if the insert is not staying level with the table, typically there are jack screws that come either through the table and they kiss the bottom of the insert, and that's what holds it level, or there are screws that go through the insert and kiss the top of the table, and that's what holds it level. In either case, I would use the blue Loctite, not the red. I'd use the blue Loctite to lock up those threads and try to keep that in place. Albert says, hello George. Hello Albert. Merrimack, Massachusetts. Is there any major difference between latex paint and latex stain? Looking to finish a table, and I find that some latex paints remain sticky even after it dries, especially in humid weather. Is there a latex paint or stain that dries harder and less sticky? Wow. Well, it's got to dry. Yeah, I mean, if it's not drying, we got a thing, because it's got to cure. If your shop is super humid, I would try running a dehumidifier. I've run a dehumidifier in my shop many times just for this purpose. In here, I don't like running the air conditioner in the summertime just because I don't like having the AC on. But especially when I'm finishing, it'll get to a point where I have to run the air just to pull the humidity out of the air so that my finishes can dry adequately or correctly. So I would try that. I'd try dehumidifying your shop to make sure the finish dries, because I think latex paint or latex stain, you're going to have the same issue either way. If it's not curing out, it's not curing out. That being said, I'm not hugely, I don't use water-based stains. I just, as a rule, I don't use stains. So I don't have a lot of experience with it. Ross says he's had a Shopsmith for 40 years and it does things okay but not great. Accuracy is always key. Gary says, any suggestions on thickness of boards for use in a dining table glue up? The kitchen table I just built, I bought 4/4 material, I'm sorry, 5/4 material, and then my finished table was 1 inch. And I like that look a lot. That table is 32 wide, no, 36 wide, 72 long. And I felt like with that big a slab, if it was 3/4 inch stock, it would look out of scale. So that's why I went with full 1 for the tabletop, starting with 5/4. Dan asks, question is the Festool track saw worth the price, or is there a model you feel works just as well? I love my Festool track saw and I use it a lot. It is admittedly very expensive. I have got a Craig track that runs with my DeWalt circular saw, it'll run with any circular saw, and nowhere near the cut quality from that, because it's a DeWalt circular saw designed for cutting 2x4s. The Festool saw has tighter tolerances, tighter bearings, and not just Festool, but many track saws have those attributes. I know people, this is statistic of one stuff. I know people who are very happy with the DeWalt. I know people with the cordless Makita track saw that they're very happy with. I haven't tried them. So just speaking of my own experience, the Festool has served me very well, but I know it's expensive. I would look for some magazine, Wood Magazine does tool tests all the time. And I would Google track saw tool tests and look for objective tests where they've looked at 6 or 8 systems and see what they say. Is your shop separate from where you live, as in somewhere to drive to every day? Separate from where I live, but somewhere to walk to. I live about a half mile from my shop. So my truck and my car can sometimes sit unused for a week at a time because I walk back and forth. Lenny's got some additional details on the dust explosion possibilities from finishing dust. Jim says, I bought a home in snow country and I'm building a new shop. Suggestion for the safest way to heat the shop in the winter. In my old shop, the furnace was in the shop. And I knew I'd have airborne dust, and I knew some finishing was going to happen in there. So I put in what was a oh man, all I can think of is internal combustion, and that's an engine. The bottom line is it was a natural gas furnace with no exposed flame. So the pilot igniter was in a sealed chamber and the flame was in a sealed chamber. So there was zero way, and the air intake was PVC pipe that came in from the outside, was my air intake, and then it was high efficiency. So the exhaust was another PVC pipe that went out. So there was zero chance for stuff to get to the flames. So that would be a choice. Electric heat. In my part of the country, electric heat is an expensive way to heat a building, but that would be another choice. And there are probably other ones out there. I would really talk to an HVAC person and describe what's going on, describe your setup and see what they recommend. Oh, yep, Alistair, yeah, we'll go back to the glue up thing. I'm going to cut this piece of cedar right here, and then we'll walk over there. Russ, watching from Emily, Minnesota, still building fishing rods, which I've seen, and they're beautiful, and turning wood handles. Very nice. Robert asks, how is your hand? Thanks for asking. It's way more better. So I had a little ligament injury on my left hand. This is week 6 of 8. Yeah, Tyler's reminding me because I answered this question earlier in a live stream. Week 6 of 8 of having them taped. In all honesty, I can't wait for the tape to come off because it's killing me. I'm like the Penguin from the Batman movies, and it's killing me. Let me quickly cut this piece of cedar, and then we're going to head for the glue table and answer, kind of walk Alistair through a glue up. All right. Walk this way. Without dropping the laptop. I'm going to get stuff while you're coming this way. All right, here's some tips, Alistair. First, good clamps. Here's the thing, parallel jaw clamps are not inexpensive. I think that these 30-inch clamps are about 45 or 50 bucks. However, they're a really good investment for glue ups because the jaws don't flex, hence the name parallel jaws. They really do a good job of helping your work stay straight. So if you can do it, get 2 of these. 30 inch is a great versatile length. Then, on your boards. Now these have not been jointed, but I would go to my jointer, and then I would take the boards and I would do this. And when you do this with hand pressure, you should be able to close this joint. If you do this and you can still see light, go back to the joiner. We're not asking the clamps to close the joint. The joint should close on its own. So you got to have good edges. That's joiner work. Then, how many clamps? The way to think about your clamps is that when I have my clamps on my work and I start to tighten, I did a lousy job cutting these 3 boards to uniform length. When I start to tighten, there's a cone of pressure that comes off the clamp, and it's about a 45-degree cone. So when I look at my clamp position, I want the cone from this clamp to overlap the cone from this clamp. So 45 degrees, this looks like a pretty good setup for this. If 2 clamps isn't enough to get the overlap on the pressure cone, you have to add another clamp. As you start to tighten, now of course we've got glue on here, stuff has a propensity to swim around a little bit. If it's a big glue up like that hickory table I was talking about, I'll put biscuits in there, not to reinforce the joint, because the joint is plenty strong without them, but to help align the surfaces so that they stay in alignment, so I'm not doing weeks of sanding later. The other trick for that is to take a clamp, and I'm going to turn this so you can see more better. So the other way to make sure these boards stay level is to take a clamp, bridge the seam. At this point your bar clamps would still be loose. Bridge the seam, tighten, and just snug is good. What that pad is doing is holding those surfaces level. And then close the clamp. So good clamps, good joinery. Locate the clamps so you have a pressure cone that overlaps each other. Clamping cauls can be an option, or clamps like this to help level things out. Biscuits in the joint to help level things out. If you go on GOA.com and you Google and you search clamping tips, there you'll find a video that walks through a glue up like this. Okay. Jenny, Paul is asking about the shop dog, so you probably got to bring her over here. And then this will be our wrap up, and we'll get Sam out. Sam and Tyler and Jenny can all go home. You aren't going to believe the tolerant dog that's about to come into the frame here. So this is Vida. Jenny, what kind of dog is Vida?
A Newfie Chow.
A Newfie
We
Chow.
think she's a rescue.
She's a rescue. Was originally in New Mexico is where we got her, right?
Yeah.
Came from a kill shelter in New Mexico, so Jenny saved her life, and that's how she got the name Vida, which is Espanol for life. What else do you want to tell us about her? 8 years old or so, right?
She's 10.
10 years old.
She's a good girl.
She's a good girl. She doesn't mind the tools in here. Very tolerant of loud noise. But thankfully, you know, like grandchildren, I like the dog, but she goes home at the end of the day because it's Ginny's dog. So that's Vida. All right, can we wrap up? Thanks again to the folks at Titebond for sponsoring. Very much thanks. Thanks to you a lot. What am I saying? Thank you for watching and tuning in tonight. And we should be on track for second Thursday in October, 7 p.m. Central Time will be our next live like this. And I'm working on a guest. It'll either be October or November, but we'll have a guest. More on that later. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and get out there in the shop and make chips, man.